Need your daily fix on mixed martial arts?
We're going to kind of recap Bellator 155 from UFC 198.
Who's who?
Kind of a controversial decision.
And who's not.
I couldn't figure out why, and then it hit me.
Well, don't you fret, because Golden State Media Concepts got you covered. Get your daily dose of MMA podcast. Everything from the UFC, Bellator Fighting Championships, Extreme Cage Fighting, Invicta Fighting Championships, and so much more. Join us as we talk about some of the biggest names in mixed martial arts. We've got you covered here on Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast.
All right, now, thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Mixed Martial Arts Podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Tate, and today we are doing the post-fight show for UFC Fight Night, Weidman versus Gastelum. And if you haven't seen the fight, because we're just finishing the fight here now, if you haven't seen the fight, this is not the episode for you to watch. I recommend, or listen to. I recommend pausing this, waiting until after you've seen the fight, then tune into this episode, because I don't want to give away anything. I know a lot of fans will watch it later that night or even the next day. So I'd like to give you just a little heads up. With that being said, I'm going to pause for a quick second, let you pause it, and then I'm going to jump right into things. All right, so we just finished the fight, UFC Fight Night in New York, Long Island, and we just saw Chris Weidman defeat Kelvin Gastelum in the third round with an arm and neck triangle. And this fight did not disappoint whatsoever. Gastelum's a tough fighter, man. I personally thought he was fighting in the wrong weight class, but he really put up a good showing. This was a really big deal for Chris Weidman because he was coming off of a 3-fight losing streak. He had lost to Yoel Romero. He had lost and then he just lost to Gegard Moussafi, and then Luke Rockhold as well when he lost his title. So this was the fight that he needed. He desperately needed to get this win, to get back on the winning track, and to get back in contention here. And I tell you what, I mean, this fight, it was just an amazing fight to watch. In the first round, it was a typical Chris Weidman type fight, where his length and his range and his wrestling skills were the key for most of the first round. But a surprising thing happened. Weidman went to drop back straight back, which instead of normally when you're fighting a fighter who's definitely a striker and a dangerous striker, you tend to rotate. You never fall directly back. And he made that mistake. And Kelvin Gastelum, right at the very end of the first round, cracked him and nailed him. Dropped him at the very end of the round. As a matter of fact, later when you watch the interview right after the fight, Chris talks about how that was the first time he'd ever been dropped in the ring. You could see at the end of that first round, the ghosts were starting to come back. You could see the look on Chris's face. He was hit. It was more of a flash knockdown, and he was fine. but you could see the ghost of not again. This cannot happen again. And this is where I personally think that Gastelum made the biggest mistake of all. It seemed like his main plan was to be patient and buy his time and be consistent throughout the fight. You could tell he put in a game plan for a 5-round battle. Because the biggest mistake, I think the biggest switch in this fight was when Chris had that moment of, oh God, not again, go on. The start of the second round, I think Gastelum should have went for broke. He should have pressed. He should have really put a lot of pressure on him when Weidman was tight and nervous, because this was Chris Weidman's hometown, and he really wanted to win. He was on a 3-fight losing streak. He needed that win. He couldn't afford a 4th loss. That was the time to really jump in his head, put a lot of pressure on him, and cause him to make a mistake. But I admire a fighter for sticking to his game plan. I thought he was a little too patient. He didn't press the issue, and it allowed Chris to get his head together, get those ghosts off his shoulder and out of his mind, clear the cobwebs, and go back to his game plan, in which Chris was, once again, there was just a huge size difference. Chris is a very, very large middleweight, and Gastelum was very small for the middleweight division. He really should be at a welterweight division, but and that's where I think he's going to end up going back to. But the size was height. He had the height, he had the arm range, and he had the wrestling skill. So it was, I think he had, I don't know how many takedowns total, but it was like 7 to 8 takedowns that Chris was able to achieve. And Gastelum was able to get up a lot of times and get taken back down, but it allowed Chris Weidman to get back into his comfort zone of what he does best. It allowed him to stick with his game plan and get the boogeyman off his shoulders about being worried about something crazy, like with, when you're talking about, let's say, Gegard Moussafi and the weird situation where, he put one hand down, he ended up getting kneed, and it ended up costing him. The Yoel Romero knee. The spin move with Luke Rockhold. So I thought it was, I thought the key to beating Chris was to make sure those boogeymen came back to cause him problems. And because of the fact that how calm and patient Gastelum was, it allowed Chris to settle down and get back into the groove, and Chris is a very tough fighter and a very smart fighter, so he used his wrestling game to control the fight, control the tempo. He won round 2 quite easily because of the knockdown. I actually gave round 1 to Gastelum because it was a significant knockdown. Round 3, so like I said, round 2 was Chris Weidman. Round 3, Gastelum came out with a little bit more sense of urgency, and he was touching Chris Weidman. He was landing good shots. Once again, Chris's wrestling skills really came into play. The length. The big issue was the length, where when a fighter's normally the same length, a lot of times you can, if you bend down, you don't have to worry about a guy just reaching over with your leg and starting to take your back, or just reaching around. Chris Weidman's arms were so much longer that he could reach in and really get a tight hold, or reach his legs over. He could control everything. And once Chris figured out that to get Gastelum off of the fence, because I think Gastelum's game plan was to wrestle Chris Weidman on the fence and make him expel a lot of energy and let him burn out and then take him out late in the fight. I think that was the game plan, because that's kind of the way it seemed. In the third, I thought Chris made a really good decision to start pulling him away from the fence and not allowing him to use the fence to kind of wear him down, because I thought Chris was using a lot of energy. And once he started doing that, his wrestling just kind of took control of the fight. Eventually, the arm triangle came in. Gastelum tried very hard to straighten out the arm, because the best thing to do if you're in a head arm triangle, the best thing to do is kind of straighten out that arm so that you can take pressure off of the neck. But with the fact that Chris had such long arms and he's such a big fighter, it was just too much. And Gastelum eventually he ended up tapping out. And Chris was super happy because he got the monkey off his back. He ended his 3-fight losing streak. And it really and in his true hometown of Long Island, New York. In his interview, he talks about how people are doubting him, and talking about how he's back and how he overcame adversity. And so that was a really good thing. And then when you look at Gastelum, I'm going to tell you this right now. Even though he lost, he's 25. He really showed that he has the skills that it will take to be a champion. I think he needs to go down and weight. I think eventually he will become a champion. I think, matter of fact, he proved himself in a loss tonight. And what does this win do for Chris Weidman other than in that 3-fight losing streak? With the way that division has been put on hold, where Michael Bisping hasn't fought in a while, as they were trying to figure out if he's going to fight GSP, is he fighting Robert Whittaker? Everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. That division has been put on hold for about a year. If that division would have been moving forward, Chris Weidman would be really out of the picture right now with the 3 losses. But because the division has been kind of put on hold, you have a situation here where Chris Weidman is, I say, his next fight, I'm guessing, is going to be like a Yoel Romero, someone like that, a Jacare. He pulls off a win against like a Yoel or a Jacare, and he's right back in the title picture. And he's either two fights from a title shot, or I could easily see him being 2 fights from a title shot now. This was a really big win for him. And so I think this really sets him up for, it's going to be a situation where Bisping is going to, I'm not sure if he's going to fight GSP or not. If that fight happens, then it'll be, or is it going to be the title match where the interim champion and Whittaker, it's going to be Bisping and Whittaker. It looks like it's going to be Bisping and Whittaker that's going to fight here. But after that fight, in that same time frame, if Chris Weidman comes off with another big win, he could be right back in this picture for a title shot here. Also, you also have Luke Rockhold, who's coming back. They announced that he was going to be fighting soon as well. Then you also had on this night here is they had an interview during the fight between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier. And I was looking forward to seeing this. That was, because their fight is coming up next week. And with Jon Jones being out for a while for, reasons, everyone knows the story of Jon Jones and the trouble that he's gotten into and the big grudge that these two had. The thing that normally an interview like that doesn't really tell me much of anything. But one of the things that it did do this time was it made me question things. I'm a big DC fan. I'm also a big Jon Jones fan. And when I watched this interview, I was surprised at who was getting under whose skin. It is very clear after watching this interview that Daniel Cormier has actually gotten under Jon Jones' skin. He didn't want to be there. He didn't look like himself. If you're, scoring the fight, the mental battle, I'm surprised to say this, is going to Daniel Cormier. Normally when I look at the mental battle and I look at these two early in previous fights and previous interviews, I've always taken that Jon Jones knows how to get under Cormier's skin, the crowd, but Cormier seemed way more comfortable, and Jon Jones wanted to be anywhere but doing that interview. As a matter of fact, Jon Jones didn't even really let them wrap up the interview before he started standing up to leave. He seemed angry. He seemed flustered. And I'll tell you this. That's one of the things that's made Conor McGregor such a successful fighter, is winning the fight before you ever step in the ring. And before seeing this, I definitely thought that Jon Jones was going to win this fight. There's cause for pause. I'm really not sure what's going to happen here, but it's going to be interesting. And like I said, round one, before the fight, the pre-round one, it actually has gone to Cormier, and I'm shocked. With that, we're going to go on a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the UFC Fight Night in New York. Stay tuned.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, we're back, and we are doing the UFC Fight Night in Long Island, New York. Weidman versus Gastelum post-fight. And next we're going to talk about the co-main event. And we're actually going to talk about the co-main event and some other fights that took place on this card and my thoughts on them. In the co-main event, you had Darren Elkins, who won a very close decision against Dennis Bermudez. I scored it for Elkins. I thought his takedowns, he had some huge takedowns that really allowed him to control the fight. I scored it 2-1. The judges kind of scored it kind of the same way. The first judge scored it 29-28 Elkins. The second one was 29-28 Bermudez. And then the third one was 29-28 Elkins. It pretty much just came down to the fact that you had Elkins just applied a lot of pressure and really just put Elkins in a very put Bermudez in a very uncomfortable place where he had to overcome those takedowns. And those takedowns truly was the difference in who won this fight, especially when it was, you came with a split decision. You also had Patrick Cummins, who won a split decision. You also, let's see, other fights that were actually really, really interesting was Jimmie Rivera and Thomas Almeida. That was a fight where, these guys really took it to each other. In the first round, Rivera dropped Almeida twice. And then the second round, Almeida actually ended up catching Rivera. And then what kind of came down to, when you look at this fight, I had a 1-1 going into the third. Jimmie Rivera just applied a lot of pressure to Thomas Almeida, took him down a couple of times, and that was enough for him to pull off an impressive victory. One fight that I do want to talk about that really caught my eye was Rafael Natal versus a newcomer making his UFC debut, Eryk Anders. Now, I had never even heard of Eryk Anders, but I knew he had an 8-0 record, and I heard he was pretty impressive. He was a former linebacker for University of Alabama Crimson Tide, won a national championship in 2009. And when you start off with talking about something like, a guy who was a big part of a national championship football team, that a guy like that is an athlete. That a guy like that is a strong, powerful athlete who can handle himself. Now, the question I had was, does he have the skills to actually compete in the UFC? And when I was watching the fight, the one thing I noticed was he was very raw. But this guy has power. He was landing some big shots. He really was taking it to Natal, and he finished him off. Just impressive. I'm really looking forward to seeing him fight again. I will definitely keep an eye out for him. And speaking of impressive knockouts, Alex Oliveira fought on the card, and he fought Laflare. I can't pronounce his name. Ryan Laflare. And Cowboy had a walk-off knockout that you just have to see it. Ryan came in and he was pressing. He kind of telegraphed that he was going to charge in, and Cowboy just timed it perfect. And when he nailed him, it was curtains. It was lights out. Spectacular knockout. That's how there was, and that's the thing about this card. There wasn't a lot of huge names on this card, but you had a situation where you had a lot of fighters making their debut. You had a couple of spectacular knockouts, and then you had a main event with Chris Weidman that did not disappoint. It was a really great card, and if you haven't had a chance to see it, you should definitely tune in. But this concludes our post-fight coverage of the UFC Fight Night, Weidman versus Gastelum. We'll have more to talk about this in more detail on at the beginning of this week, probably Monday or Tuesday. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up, and I am out.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.